The following video is something which I uploaded to French with James a couple of years ago, and which in that time got over 30,000 views, nearly 700 likes, and received lots of comments from students who found it really useful when they were preparing for their French GCSE exam. Now, the reason I've decided to put it here on Spanish with James is to reach more people, because essentially this channel has more subscribers and a better ranking on YouTube, but the channel's still very much about Spanish, so it's just a one-off French video. There is a Spanish equivalent for the GCSE Spanish exam, which you can find on my channel.
Les objectifs de cette leçon sont connaître les différentes parties de l'examen écrit, comprendre ce qu'il faut faire pour réussir dans cet examen, et apprendre un acronyme qu'on peut utiliser comme aide-mémoire. The objectives of this lesson are to get to know the different parts of the written exam, to understand what one must do to succeed in this exam, and also to learn an acronym that we can use as an aide-mémoire, a bit of a memory aid, to help us remember that criteria for success when we're in the exam. Que sont les différentes parties de l'examen écrit? What are the different parts of the written exam? Now, the higher tier writing paper consists of just 3 sections. The first is a 90-word question, which is based on 4 bullet points and it's worth 16 marks. This question is called the crossover question because it's the first one on the higher paper, and it's also exactly the same as the 4th one on the foundation paper. So you'll sit this one whether you do foundation or higher. The second section is a 150-word question, which is based on just 2 bullet points, and that one's worth 32 marks, which is more than half of the whole paper. And finally, the third section consists of a translation activity where you need to take a passage of text in English and translate it into French, and that one's worth 12 marks. The whole exam, all 3 sections, will be based on content from the GCSE topics that you've been studying, but you won't know which topics are going to come up until you're sat in the exam and you read the questions. So that's why it's important to make sure you revise all of the vocab from all of the different topics more or less equally, because you don't know what's going to come up. The first section, the 90-word crossover question, requires you to answer all aspects of the question, and that means writing about all of the 4 bullet points. You don't need to cover them equally, so you could write 2 sentences on one, 3 sentences on another, but you do need to make sure you mention really clearly each of those 4 bullet points. To ensure you do that, I recommend that first you work out what the bullet points mean, maybe write some notes alongside them in English, and then also make sure you've really understood what tenses they're in, what tenses they're asking you to respond in. You need to make sure you refer to at least 3 time frames, for example, past, present, and future. And sometimes the bullet points specifically ask you to talk about something that's coming up in the future or something that you did in the recent past, but sometimes there might just be 3 bullet points in the present tense and 1 in the past tense, so you've got to try and sneak in a 3rd tense and throw a future tense in there somewhere. And it's also important that you include at least a couple of opinions. And it's always good practice to make sure that you give reasons for your opinion, so don't just say, I like such and such, but say, I like such and such because, and then give a bit of a reason. Now, the first thing, when you look at the 90-word question, the first thing you should notice is that you get a choice. So have a look at this question, 1.1, on the higher exam. This is question 4.1 on the foundation one. And then have a look at what the other option is. Take a look at what the themes are. So this one's on the theme of work. It might be that the other one's on holidays or it's on school. And have a think about which themes you feel more confident with, which ones you've studied more recently, which ones maybe you've done a bit more revision for, and think about the register. So once you've picked which one you're going to write, have a look at that very first line, because it will tell you something like you're writing a blog, or you're writing an email or a letter to a friend, and that should help you decide what sort of language you're going to use and how you're going to how you're going to open your writing. Then we need to look at the 4 bullet points. Think about what tenses they're in. So this one, the jobs or the careers of your parents, that's the present tense. We can use the present tense to talk about that one. The next bullet point specifically asked us about à l'avenir, about the future. So we need to make sure we respond in a way that means we're using the future tense, or we could use the conditional tense. In the future, I would like to do whatever job it may be. The best thing is to reuse the words from the bullet point. For example, we could start off à l'avenir and then say je vais être, or je serai, or je voudrais être, and then talk about what occupation you'd like. The third bullet point asks us what we would not like to do for a job, so that's the conditional. We can respond to that one with the conditional. And finally, if there are problems with unemployment in your town, that one's present tense. So these bullet points are quite good because here it's forcing us to use the present, the future, and the conditional at the very least. but you can always try and sneak in a past tense there as well. For example, in the first one, your parents work, you could always say, now my dad is a plumber, but before he was such and such, or he used to be a teacher. So you're sort of sneaking in an extra tense just to show off the range of language you can use in French. Now it is a 90-word task, but you can be a little bit under or a little bit over. It won't make much difference. If you're a lot under, it probably means you haven't given enough detail and enough information to get the best mark. And if you do go over, it won't gain you extra marks for content, but it could count against you for language if you make mistakes. So try to get more or less around 90 words. The must-haves for this 90-word question are 3 tenses at the very least, and try to explicitly refer to those time frames, hier, l'année dernière, à l'avenir, so that if you get the grammar a bit wrong, the examiner can still see that you're talking about a different time frame. Make sure you give a couple of opinions, at least 2, and try and give reasons for them, and extra details like descriptions, time phrases, or who you've done things with. The optional extras are other people's opinions, so instead of je pense que, ma mère pense que, so talking about what someone else thinks, and extra tenses like sneaking in a conditional, or in this one where you need to use the conditional, maybe trying to sneak in a past tense like a passé composé or an imperfect. We're now going to take a look at how we can answer this first bullet point and work our way up the mark scheme. So the first bullet point from the example question is les boulots de vos parents, the work or occupations of your parents. If you just said something like mon père est coiffeur, my dad's a hairdresser, that kind of touches upon the subject, but it doesn't really give a good enough response. You're only talking about one parent, it's asking you to talk about both. And remember, you can make this up as well, it doesn't need to be true. So we could extend that and say mon père est coiffeur et ma mère est avocate. My dad's a hairdresser and my mum is a lawyer or a solicitor. That would answer the bullet point, but we're not really doing ourselves any favours by not giving opinions, not giving extra details. So we could extend that a little bit more and give an opinion and give some further details like ma mère aime son travail. My mum likes her job or loves her job. That's expressing an opinion, and we're doing an opinion in the third person, so that's showing that you can really use verbs in the third person as well. But we could extend that even more by giving a reason, a justification for our mum's opinion of her job. Mon père est coiffeur et ma mère est avocate. Ma mère aime son travail car c'est intéressant. So she likes the job because it's interesting. There we're giving further details. Now we could extend this even more by saying our mum likes the job because it's interesting, mais mon père trouve son travail ennuyeux. But my dad finds his work boring. This is showing that we can use much higher level language, much more higher level language because we're talking about what our mum thinks of her job, giving a contrasting opinion from our dad. So this is going to climb us further up the bands of the mark scheme. We could then say something about ourselves. Je veux être policier. I want to be a police officer. And again, we could extend this even more by giving more details. Why do you want to be a police officer? Je veux être policier parce que je voudrais travailler en plein air. I would like to be I want to be a police officer because I would like to work outdoors. That would then touch upon the second bullet point. So it's kind of smoothly covering both of those bullet points. It's also giving us something about the future. Je veux être, I want to, in the future. We could even be more specific and say, à l'avenir, je veux être policier, to make sure the examiner knows we're talking about bullet point 2 now. And then we've thrown a conditional in there as well. And at the same time, we're giving a reason for why we want to do that. Exams are, to an extent, a box-ticking exercise, and it really helps if you know what sorts of boxes you're aiming to tick. So I'm going to talk you through the mark scheme that examiners use for marking this 90-word question. As I mentioned, the question's worth 16 marks in total, and these are split into 2 categories, content and language. Your content marks are a mark out of 10, and the quality of language mark is out of 6. So it's really important that you mention those bullet points because the content mark is the kind of the weightier of the 2. All of the bullet points must be covered, but not necessarily equally. So as I mentioned, you might write a bit more about one bullet point than another. That's fine. And anything irrelevant, anything that's not relevant in any way to any of the bullet points, will be completely ignored by the examiner when they're marking for content, but they will take it into account when looking at the quality of your language. So basically, it's not going to help you get any more marks, but any mistakes you make in that relevant section might count against you for the quality of language mark. So it's important to stay focused on those 4 bullet points and to not waste any time doing anything
or writing anything that's not relevant. To give you a clearer idea of just how missing a couple of bullet points out can really cap your content marks, on the mark scheme it says the following. To get 7 to 10 marks out of 10 for content, you need to have all 4 bullet points. You need to write something that answers those bullet points. If you only mention 3 bullet points, that's going to limit your mark to a maximum of 6 out of 10. Just mentioning 2 bullet points will limit your mark to a maximum of 4, and only mentioning 1 bullet point will cap you at 1 to 2 marks. So you could write 90 fantastic words in really good French, but if you kind of go off on a tangent and you only talk about 1 bullet point, you'd still get 2 out of 10 for content marks. Not including enough opinions can also cap your mark. To get into that 7 to 10 out of 10 band, you need to include at least 2 opinions. Just including 1 opinion limits you to a maximum of 6 out of 10. So you could write a fantastic piece, you could mention all 4 bullet points, but if you only put 1 opinion phrase in there, you're only going to get a maximum of 6 out of 10 for content. And including no opinions whatsoever could limit you to 2 marks. And it is easy in the exam to just forget about this requirement and to write a fantastic piece of writing about the 4 bullet points, but not put any opinions in there. So that's what this video is there to help you with, to make sure by the end you've got the tools you need to get the best possible mark that you can. And the acronym I'm going to teach you shortly will help you to remember to include opinions. It's also a good idea to get into the habit of always giving reasons for your opinions. It's not essential for the 90-word question, but in the higher paper it is essential for section 2. So it's a good habit to get into. Other than the bullet points and the opinions that we've looked at, this is the criteria that examiners use to decide your content mark. Now, if you look at that top band, to get 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 for content, you need to give a very good response that covers all aspects of the task, which you will achieve if you write at least a couple of sentences about each of those bullet points and you stay focused precisely on what the bullet points are asking you to write about. Your communication needs to be clear, so you need to get the messages across at all times, and a lot of information needs to be conveyed. So that's where you're giving extra details. You're not just saying the bare minimum for each bullet point, but you're going a bit further and giving some extra details, and you do need to express opinions. For your qualitative language mark, this is the criteria that examiners will look at. So to get into the top band there, 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 6, you need to show you can use a variety of vocabulary. So if the theme is on work, you might use using words like a lawyer, a solicitor, and a hairdresser. That's showing that you know a range of vocabulary. Or in the example I also said, I would like to be a police officer. That's showing again a range of vocabulary. Using complex structures and sentences, or at least attempting to do that. So saying things like, my mum thinks that her work is interesting, or she finds her work interesting, but my dad finds his boring. That is a complex structure. You're using sort of contrasting statements, you're using the third person of verbs, and you don't need to get it always perfectly correct. You can make minor errors, but attempting to do those more complex sentences will help you move up the mark scheme. It's essential to get into that top band to reference 3 time frames. If you just use 2 tenses or you only talk about 2 time frames, that's going to take you down to the 3 to 4 band. Again, these are largely successful. You don't need to get all of the tenses 100% correct 100% of the time. That's where your insurance policy is making sure you include phrases like à l'avenir or l'année dernière, so that if you get the grammar a bit wrong, at least you've explicitly, really clearly referred to a point in time so that the examiner still sees that you've used 3 time frames, or you've attempted to use 3 different tenses. You can make quite a few minor errors and still get into the top band, and you can even make a couple of serious errors, especially when you're having a go at more complex structures and sentences. The key thing is that the intended meaning is nearly always clear. So if those 90 words, if a French person were to read them, they'd get most of it, maybe 80 or so words. They'd know exactly the messages you're trying to express. Now, to help you remember this success criteria, all these boxes that you need to tick off when you're in the exam, I've come up with the acronym POP-FODGE. It's maybe not the best one, but it's the best I could come up with. And this should help you to remember to use present tense, opinion, past, future, another opinion, and justifications. When you've decided which of the 90-word questions you want to answer, you should go through the bullet points, translate what you can, think about the tenses, and I'd also recommend you just write in the top corner POP-FODGE with a little box next to each of the letters that you can tick off as you're going through and writing your response. That will help you to make sure when you've written your 90-word answer, you've definitely done everything you possibly can to not limit yourself from accessing those higher bands on the mark scheme.
Present tense, it's almost impossible not to use that one, so that's one you can tick off very easily. For your first opinion, you could use opinion phrases like à mon avis or je pense que to be sure that the examiner sees that you're using opinion phrases to really highlight to them that you're giving an opinion. You could just say something like être avocat, c'est ennuyeux. Being a lawyer is boring. That's giving an opinion, but be really specific. Say je pense que être avocat, c'est ennuyeux. Past tenses, you've got options. You could use the passé composé, which is the j'ai with the past participle, or je suis with the past participle, or you could use the imperfect. Now, an easy way to slot the imperfect in there is to say something in the passé composé, like je suis allé au parc, and then to give an opinion à mon avis, c'était amusant. Future tenses, you've got two you could choose from. The near future, which is the verb aller plus an infinitive, like je vais aller, je vais manger, or the simple future, j'écouterai. Now, an easy way to make sure you use two future tenses is to use the phrase ce sera, it will be. So you could use the near future tense like à l'avenir, je vais être policier. In the future, I'm going to be a police officer. Et ce sera fantastique, and it will be fantastic. That way, you're giving an opinion and you're also showing the examiner you can use two future tenses. For your second opinion phrase, instead of repeating the same ones, à mon avis, je pense que, je crois que, show greater variety of language. The best thing is to use the phrase je dirais que, because that means I would say that, which is a conditional phrase. So again, it's showing the examiner not just that you're giving another opinion, but you're doing it using another tense. So you've got a really broad knowledge of the French language. And then lastly, you could give an opinion, something that someone else thinks. Selon ma mère, according to my mum, or selon mes amis, according to my friends, they think that such and such. So you're using the third person. And finally, making sure you've got your justification. So when you've used your opinion phrase, you've given an opinion, you always follow it up with a car or parce que, and then a reason. It doesn't need to be a really long reason. It could just be something quite simple. It could just be parce que c'est with an adjective. Moving on to look at section 2, which is the 150-word question. This one, again, requires you to answer all aspects of the question, which means writing about 2 bullet points this time. And again, not necessarily equally. It doesn't have to be 75 words on each. You could write 60 words on one and 90 words on the other. That would be fine. And again, the best thing to do is to first work out what the bullet points mean. Make sure you've definitely understood the question. You've understood what tenses you need to use to respond. Is it asking you about the past, the future, the present? Is it asking you about your opinions? Is it asking you what you would do or what you would like to do? This section has a lot more freedom. You've got more to say and less to guide you. So it's really easy to go off topic. So make sure you plan for this one. Look at the bullet points and think, okay, it's asking me, it could be asking you about your parents' jobs. That's not something you can easily write 75 words on. So you could very easily then get to, kind of go off on a tangent. Whereas if you think about, okay, I can talk about what my parents used to do, what they used to think of their old jobs, what they're doing now, and what they'd like to do in the future. That way you can really show off your French skills while staying on topic. Again, you need to ensure you refer to at least 3 time frames. So generically past, present, and future, but I'd recommend you aim for 5 tenses. So trying to use a couple of past tenses, the perfect, passé composé, and the imperfect. And that could just be using c'était, or you could talk about what someone used to do in the past. Using the future, try and use 2 futures if you can, the near future, and then you could use the simple future. And again, that could just be using the phrase ce sera, and the conditional as well, which is really easy to use if you just use je voudrais with an infinitive verb. To get the top marks, you need to express and justify at least 2 opinions. So that's where it's really good to get into the habit of always justifying your opinions as well as in the 90-word question, because when you do this question, you're already in really good habits and it will be second nature to you to do that. So with this one, we're going to go straight in and have a look at the mark scheme. It's worth 32 marks in total, and that's more than half of this paper. So it's essential that you get this question right, that you give a really, really good response. These marks are split into 3 categories this time. The biggest one is content, which is worth 15 marks. Then you've got range of language, which is worth 12, and finally 5 marks for accuracy. Only mentioning one bullet point caps you at 12 out of 15, so again, it's essential that you mention both. And once again, anything irrelevant, it won't win you anything for content, but it could count against you if you make mistakes for your language and accuracy marks. Not justifying your opinions can, just like in the last section, it can cap your mark. So to get 10 to 15 marks, you need to have 2 opinions expressed and justified. So even if you write opinion, justification, and then a second opinion, but you forget to justify that second one, you're not going to get more than 10 out of 15 for content. Expressing two opinions but not justifying them limits you to 9 marks. So 2 opinions but with no justifications, the max you can get is 9 out of 15. And expressing just one opinion limits you to 6 marks. Even if you give a justification for it, you need to have 2 opinions, 2 justifications. And again, that acronym will help you to remember that. If you make a checklist for yourself in the exam, that will make sure that before you move on to the next section, you've gone back through and you've checked you've got all of those elements. Finally, no opinions could cap you at 3 marks. This is the content criteria for the 150-word question. So if we look at that top band, 13 to 15 out of 15, an excellent response which is fully relevant and detailed. So loads of detail, always relevant in some way to one of those 2 bullet points. It conveys a lot of information, and that's where planning can help you to make sure that you've achieved that. Communication is clear with little or no ambiguity. So this time, to get into the top band, not just does it have to nearly always get the message across, but it pretty much does get the message across all of the time. So a native French speaker could read that and understand everything that you're trying to communicate. And the opinions are expressed and justified. Now, obviously, getting the top band in everything would be a solid grade 9, and that's not always achievable for everyone. So have a pause of the video, have a look at the other things, and it should help you, the other bands, and it should help you to realize where you can make a few mistakes. Sometimes it can be a bit unclear, but how you can still get, let's say, 8 marks out of 15. If we look at the 7 to 9 band, there can be some things that aren't clear. It's generally relevant, so you might go off topic sometimes, but the key thing there is you've still got opinions expressed and justified. The key thing is using that acronym, using the checklist to make sure you've done all of the core elements so that even if some of it's not 100%, at least you've done what you need to do to get up into that band, because if you forget to do your opinions, that's going to take you way down. For range of language, this is the criteria. So the top band, 12 out of 12, or 10 or 11 out of 12, requires you to give a really good variety of vocabulary and structures, so a variety of language, of grammar, and of relevant topical vocab, and more complex sentences are handled with confidence. So in the last one, in the 90-word, you just needed to attempt more complex things, but to really triumph in this one, you need to be able to show that you know your stuff. You can do quite complex stuff with ease, and you can get it right. It's the piece of writing that you produce is fluent and coherent. It all makes sense. Again, have a pause of the video and look at the other bands, because if we look at the second one down, it's mainly fluent. So there are occasional lapses. There are a few things that don't quite go to plan. That doesn't stop you getting a grade 8 or even a grade 9. You don't need to be in the top band in every single question in order to get a grade 9 at GCSE. And the final criteria is for the accuracy mark. Now this is where your accents and getting the right adjective endings and all those things do make a difference, because even though it's only at 5 marks, sometimes getting a couple marks more can be the difference between a grade boundary. So to get 5 out of 5, it needs to be accurate throughout the response, but there can still be a few errors, especially when you've attempted more complex stuff. So again, you can really get the highest band in this one with still a few mistakes. It doesn't have to be completely flawless. Again, pause the video and have a read through this criteria and then push play and we'll move on. Now for the 150-word question, some students helped me to adapt the POPFODG acronym to POOP JFK. And this has a lot of the same elements, but it has an extra thing as well. So we're going to look at what this stands for. It stands for present, opinion, another opinion, past tenses, justifications, future tenses, and then conditional with a K, just to make JFK work. So again, it's very similar to POPFODG, and you can use whichever one works best for you, remembering to use a range of opinion phrases, not just repeating the same one over and over, to show that you've got a good, broad range and variety of language at your disposal. Using your past tenses like the passé composé, the imperfect, making sure you justify with car, parce que, and again, try and use both of those, because if you just use parce que every time, it's not showing the examiner that you've got such a broad range of vocabulary. Using your future tenses, the simple future or the near future, and then finally making sure you throw in a conditional, which could just be using je voudrais with an infinitive, or using je dirais que or ce serait, it would be. The final section, section 3 of the higher GCSE French exam, is translation. Now for this one you need to translate a text from English, it's about 50 words long, into French, and it's going to be based on one of the GCSE themes. The marks for this question are split into two categories. The first one is conveying key messages, which basically means you're getting the message across. Even if not perfectly, it's understandable. The second one is application of grammatical knowledge of language and structures, which is a long-winded way of saying you know the vocab and you know the grammar. To get the top marks in this one, you need to make sure you translate every part of the text and ensuring that you use the correct tenses, the correct verb endings, and the correct adjectival endings. If you miss out parts of the translation because you're not sure, say there's a whole phrase and you're not sure, so you just leave it out, the examiner will have to consider that had you have had a go at that, you would have got it seriously wrong. Because if they didn't, they'd be kind of disadvantaging students that have a go and make mistakes. So the moral of the story there is just have a go. If it's 7 words, a long phrase you don't get, but you know 3 of the words, write what you know and guess the rest, because it might be that you get a tick for those 3 words and not for the other 4, but at least you had a go and you picked up an extra mark as a result. So looking at the key messages criteria, you need to convey all key messages to get 6 out of 6. On the mark scheme, the translation, the 50 words, will be split into 13 key messages, and each one of those is worth a tick. Now, a tick doesn't necessarily mean a mark. If you look at the total ticks, they match up with different marks. So you could get 8 ticks, that would be a mark 4, a 4. If you got 9 ticks, it would also be a 4. 10 ticks would also be a 4. And that's where getting an extra tick can be the difference between getting a 5 or a 4 or a 3. Minor errors won't lose you the tick. This is about getting the message across. The examiner will ask themselves, would a native speaker get the message? If you use the wrong article, you use le instead of la, it's not going to make much difference. Someone would still understand what you're saying. So have a go. You can make a few mistakes and still get 6 out of 6 for this part of section 3. For the application of grammatical knowledge of language and structures, this is the criteria the examiner will use. So for this one to get 6 out of 6, you need to show that you know your vocab, you know your grammar, you've got your spellings, you've got your accents, and it's virtually faultless. As I've said, to get 7, 8, and 9 at GCSE, you don't need to always be in those top bands. The key thing I want you to take away from this video is, what are the things you can do to boost your grade? What are the things that you need to make sure you remember when you're in the exam to make sure you're not self-limiting the marks you can get? And where are the easy marks that you can take away? So the easy marks are in the writing ones, to make sure you've got your 3 tenses, you've got your opinions, you've mentioned the bullet points. And in this one, it's making sure you've done the best you can to communicate the key messages, even if you've made a few minor mistakes. That brings us to the end of the video. I hope it's been useful. Some next steps is just to practice. Ask your teacher for some past papers that you can have a go at. You can write them, get feedback. You could even just make up your own exam questions or get past papers from AQA website, write your response, and then use the criteria you've seen in this video to self-mark that response. Make sure you've made a note of one of the acronyms, whichever one you think is going to be most useful for you, and hopefully you've been able to identify areas where you might need to improve. For example, when I was looking at those acronyms, you might think, oh, I'm not sure I could use the conditional tense. Go away and have a look at that again and revise it to make sure you've got the best chance of getting the best grade you possibly can in the exam.